Hello, friends, and welcome to this edition of the Coming In for a Landing podcast. I am your host, Paul Hudrick, and I am joined by a very talented man. You've seen his work most likely in Philadelphia, this area. You've seen him in Liberty Ballers, but he is all over the place doing his thing. A lot of really good features, especially recently, covering the whole NBA, not just the Sixers. And that is Jackson Frank. Jackson, thank you so much for coming on, man. I appreciate you.
Yeah, appreciate you coming on, Paul, and appreciate the kind words.
Of course. And it's pretty cool because I always like to kind of look at things from a perspective of, focusing on the positives more so than the negatives. Obviously, there have been a lot of negatives about the Zoom era we've all been living in and, everything with the pandemic and how that's changed our coverage. But you and I probably wouldn't have had as many interactions and wouldn't have done as many things had that not happened. If I was covering the team traditionally and you didn't have the opportunity to cover it remotely the way you are. So, yeah, one of the positives has been that. So it's pretty cool that, and now here you are on this podcast, and you and I have done numerous locker rooms together, which is a really cool app if people don't know about that. And Jackson, you do those pretty often with different people around the league and previewing different series. So pretty cool stuff that I would strongly encourage anyone to check out. But the reason for having Jackson on today is to preview Sixers and the Atlanta Hawks. We now know that is the matchup. Going to be obviously a much, much more difficult challenge for the Philadelphia 76ers going up against this Hawks team that really turned it on with a coaching change with Nick McMillan. Also with just health, they became a healthier team. That was a big part of it as well. Looking at all the matchups, we definitely want to look at all of them, want to look at Joel Embiid and, what his absence or what his presence could mean and the Sixers rotation. But I think we have to start this with Trae Young, who was just sensational in the first round, really sensational all season long. One of the most dangerous offensive players in the entire league. When Doc Rivers spoke on Friday, he talked about the idea of showing a different coverages, showing a different looks. That's the key. That's also what he said about Bradley Beal in the first round. They did a pretty darn good job on Bradley Beal. Trae Young, gifted in other ways, does a lot of different things. So for you, Jackson, when you look at Trae Young and the issues he obviously presents, what do you think the Sixers will do, and what do you kind of think their best course of action is for, we'll say, slowing him down, because you certainly are not going to stop him?
Yeah, I think obviously the most likely they'll throw Ben Simmons on to begin. I mean, Ben is a first team all defensive caliber guy, he's a defensive player of the year finalist this year. And the key will be to prevent him from Trae getting into the paint. Like if you watch that Hawks Knicks series, when Trae played so well because he was able to get into the paint so often, and that means other defenders have to come help. And then he's an incredible passer. They have shooters around Trae too. That's the biggest difference. I think if you're kind of talking about how can they defend Trae Young versus Bradley Beal, the Sixers were able to kind of, allow other guys to take shots on the perimeter, whether it's Ish Smith, Rui Hachimura, Russell Westbrook. You can't really do that with Atlanta, right? They've got Bogdan Bogdanovic. John Collins is a good shooter. Gallinari comes in off the bench. They've got the lob threat to Capella. So there's a lot of options that Trae Young has in a way that someone like Bradley Beal or even Russell Westbrook didn't have. So that's the biggest thing, is just, not allowing Trae to get into the paint. But I think that a lot of that onus will fall on Ben Simmons, and as well as Matisse Thybulle. We don't know exactly if Matisse Thybulle will get the nod. But he's obviously started game 5, and he is, against the Wizards, he's an accomplished defender as well. So I think that'll be the biggest thing, is just, we'll see those two guys on him more or less at times. Maybe we'll see some Danny Green. I mean, as you said, Doc will talk about giving guys different looks, and Danny's a different type of defender than Matisse and Ben. So that's kind of my expectations there. But the key will just, a lot of the onus will fall on Ben Simmons, just as it will on both ends, because you mentioned kind of Joel Embiid a little bit. Even if Joel plays, he'll be a less than 100%. So there's going to fall on team's second best player, especially on defense, where he's kind of made his money the last couple of years, especially.
Right. And my biggest fear, the only reason I would think that Ben wouldn't start on Trae is fouls. That would be the only reason I would think that Doc would maybe want to preserve Ben Simmons and keep him out of foul trouble early so that he can use Ben against Trae late. And that might be that seemed to kind of be a recipe that he's gone to that's worked throughout the season, is not necessarily putting Ben on the best player from the jump, but showing Danny Green, obviously not a different defender, more relies on, at this stage of his career, more relies on savvy and smarts and reading things, as opposed to his lateral quickness isn't what it used to be. Plus he's been dealing with a hip injury all season long, which I'm sure is not helping his cause. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if Joel Embiid plays or when he plays, I guess we're saying at this point, I don't know, but I would think that perhaps Danny Green does get the first crack at Trae just to start the games off. But to your point, if Joel Embiid is out, and I agree that I think most likely Doc Rivers would go with the Game 5 look of Matisse Thybulle, and Matisse would likely start off on Trae. And I do think that's important, though, right? I mean, to show a guy, you have three different, sure, Matisse and Ben do some of the same things, but they're still different. They're still a different size, different kind of player, and then Danny Green, this likewise. So I do think there is something to that of showing a guy that's as talented as Trae, three different looks. And also, you're kind of preserving Ben, with all due respect to the, you mentioned the Hawks have some other really talented pieces, but they're not Trae Young. So, to maybe put Ben on someone like John Collins early in the game might help save him perhaps for later in the game when he does have to chase Trae around, especially around screens and everything in the third and fourth quarter. I'm curious to see what they're going to do. I mean, trapping him and blitzing him it's something that they probably will mix in, but because Trae is such a dangerous passer, and that's kind of how I'm looking at it too. Like, I almost would prefer Trae to be a scorer as opposed to just picking you apart. I mean, don't get me wrong, he's capable, right? He can score 50 points. He's very capable of that, but I almost would prefer him to keep him as a scorer. And, if he wants to take 35-foot 3-pointers, sure, he can hit them, but I would prefer that than, what you said of him getting to the paint, drawing the crowds, dishing out to Bogdanovich, dishing out to John Collins. Another name, Kevin Huerter, who was outstanding in the first round, who I've always been a big Kevin Huerter fan. And I can't believe he's still only 22 years old. So
Yeah,
he's
year three.
a really, really interesting player. And just, I guess, to kind of piggyback off that, when we're talking about matchups, I guess, so let's just, for argument's sake and just for this discussion, let's say Joel Embiid isn't in game one. How do you see, I guess we'll start with the Sixers. Where do you see the Sixers defensively? How do you see them matching up against the Hawks? Who do you see on who?
Yeah, so I think you mentioned that, you think Matisse will get the nod. I would agree. I know, after game 5, you asked Doc if, Max, he considered starting Max, and he was pretty adamant that he wasn't. But at the same time, I don't think that means that he won't close with Maxey, right? I mean, we've seen Doc kind of ride, the best performing guy, kind of in the fifth player. Then that's what we saw. I mean, obviously Doc emptied the bench, but Maxey was getting a lot of the minutes in the second half with that starting 4. So I think we'll see the same starting 5 from game 5, which in that sense, Tobias was kind of the de facto center. Obviously, Ben's the biggest player there, but I think you'd see Tobias on Capella. You'd see Ben or Danny on Trae Young and Bogdanovich. I think the last time when the Hawks and Sixers played in the regular season, I think Danny got the opening assignment on Trae, if I recall. Didn't go very well because Trae is a lot quicker than Danny, as you mentioned. Danny doesn't have the lateral mobility these days. But I think I agree that in that sense that, we've seen Ben, not like a secret weapon, but we've seen Doc play the long game sometimes. I mean, I always think back to that game against the Nets when James Harden played, and it was a close first half, and then they brought Ben. They put Ben on James Harden in the second half, and they got some more transition opportunities and maybe outscored the Nets by 10 or 12 in the third, and that was that. So I guess just my answer for that matchup would be Danny and Ben on Bogdan and Trae, and then you would go Matisse on maybe John Collins, I guess. I mean, it's not great. I mean, then you throw Seth on DeAndre Hunter. I think, like, it's not. I mean, it's just tough. I mean, the Sixers are big when they have Joel, but when you downsize like that, when you lose your 7-foot defensive anchor, everything kind of shifts around. So, I mean, there's not a great answer for some of these matchups because the Hawks have so many different guys who can create and score offense for you. So that's what I would see. I think, like, I guess the idea behind Matisse on John Collins would be Matisse's kind of length and quickness, maybe being able to deter some of those lobs that Collins likes to get. And Collins is used as a floor spacer at times too, since they have Capella. And he's good at it too. I don't know what he shot from 3 this year, but I think last year was over 40%. So
he was close to it, if not over it.
Yeah, I mean, he's very much a pick and pop threat, and they like to use him like that and those kind of and whatnot. So I would say those are the matchups, but it's a tough one. It's going to ask a lot of a guy like Matisse and even Seth Curry to an extent, because DeAndre Hunter isn't, DeAndre Hunter is the kind of the fifth option there offensively, but he did some stuff in that first round, kind of using his size and his frame to get to spots in the mid range. So we'll see. I mean, it's obvious, but it's just a tall task when you're without Joel Embiid, or if you're without Joel Embiid. So that's what I'd imagine. But as you said, it all starts with Trae. If they can do a good job on him, it makes it tougher for guys to get open. The other 4 guys. I mean, Bogdan can run some stuff with the ball in his hands, but the other three guys are a little more reliant on someone else to set them up. So it'll start with Trae, which is kind of obvious, but it's gonna require a lot of work and just I guess attention to detail for whoever gets that assignment throughout the series or whichever multiple guys, as you said.
Yeah, and it's Seth Curry's that's him defensively is definitely going to be concerned because, like you said, I mean, with the Wizards, you put him on Howell Neto, and you're okay. You can deal with that. You can live with that. You can't. I would think you can't really put him on Bogdanovich. I think he's too good of a threat off the dribble to do that. To trust Seth with that, and then DeAndre Hunter. Yeah, he's not like you said, he's probably their fifth option, but it's not a terrible fifth option. He's a pretty good offensive player. With his size and his length, he can just shoot it right over the top of Seth. So that's not a great matchup either. I would think my guess would actually be that they would go. I do agree that Tobias would start on Capella. I think that would make sense. And I think Tobias has actually handled matchups against fives okay, especially if they're not. We kind of saw like in the playoffs a couple of years ago with Toronto when Embiid guarded Siakam. You saw Tobias go out on Marcus Gasol, and he did okay. Like, it's not nothing world beating, but he held up, and that's all you could really ask of him. And I think in those matchups throughout the season, when the rare occasion they've asked him to guard fives, he's okay. And listen, if the Hawks decide, hey, we want to go to Capella in the post, like that, to me, that's a win for the Sixers. I think that would be a poor offensive strategy when you have so much other talent to do that.
Yeah, I guess the only thing might be like I think the issue not so much in the post would be if Trae's able to get into the paint, get downhill, and then Tobias just isn't kind of the vertical leaper there. Like Capella will finish over the top, but yeah, I agree that if there's any time the Hawks try to deviate away from what they like to do and post up Capella, that's a win for the Sixers. But yeah, the concern there would be can Tobias kind of play the 1-on-2s if he's the big kind of deter the lob. But yeah, for sure, I think that Tobias. Like if they ever try to attack Tobias in the post, whoever it is probably gonna that's a win for the Sixers because Tobias is a very good post defender, as you kind of mentioned there. But the bigger issue for me would be kind of how can you play, or the bigger point that I would be looking to is how can you play those lobs, because that's kind of where Capella makes his money, and he and Trae have been so good this year, in that kind of partnership.
Right, and that's why I think when it's Tobias and Ben Simmons, I feel much better about it than like say Danny Green and Tobias Harris. Because I think Ben, I think they can. I think Ben and Tobias, you could even. I mean, theoretically, it's not ideal, but you could theoretically switch it. It's not great to have Tobias then match up 1-on-1 with Trae, but again, I would sooner see Trae, step out beyond the 3-point line and take a bunch of threes as opposed to getting in the paint, drawing a crowd, or just getting those easy floaters that he seems almost automatic with, or even drawing fouls. I would prefer him to step back out to the 3-point line and do that. Not to say he can't kill you that way, but that's, given the list of poor options, that's probably the best one. But yeah, I might actually start Ben on Collins. And I know that's not, again, it's not ideal because, like, as you mentioned, John Collins has made himself a legit pick and pop threat. He's become a strong 3-point shooter through the course of his career. So that's not a guy that you want to necessarily, want to see Ben roam off of, but at the same time, maybe he can do a little bit of that. But yeah, it's like you said, without Joel Embiid, there's really no great matchups. And even quite frankly, even with Joel Embiid, if Joel Embiid struggles with something, it is those kind of lob catching bigs. We've seen him have issues with Capella in the past. When the Sixers played Houston in the past, and him and James Harden running the pick and rolls, and Embiid maybe not quite being like a step behind or just not quite reading it perfectly or whatever. And now he's going to have a knee issue. So we'll see how limited he is with that. So just a lot of matchup issues.
And there's different ways you can. I mean, I could even see them start Danny on Trae, go Matisse on Bogdan, because Bogdan loves running off of screens, and Matisse is pretty good kind of getting around those these days. And then you could go Ben on Capella and Tobias on John Collins. I think you feel pretty. I think like athletically, obviously Collins is better as a leaper than Tobias, but in terms of kind of mobility and whatnot, I think you feel pretty comfortable there. Like Collins isn't going to just like torch Tobias in space or something like that. So I think you could see a lot of different things here. But yeah, I agree about the Joel point. That's why there are a lot of reasons it's a bummer. For his own sake, it's a bummer that he's injured. But I think he has improved in some regard, kind of in that pick and roll defense. Still, kind of probably his least good ability, but I think he has taken strides this year. So I would have really been interested to see how he could handle that for 4 or 5, 6 games. But yeah, to your point, it's just a very tough matchup without Joel, because they're just working from a bit of a size disadvantage. So luckily it helps if you have 3 versatile defenders, and Matisse, Ben, and Danny, even George Hill. I think George Hill is going to play a big role in this series with his versatility and length. So you saw him play Bradley Beal a little bit, or Bradley Beal, excuse me, in the first round at times. So I mean, you've got some options there for Doc, but it just everything is harder when you have to go up against a team that has a good lob threat, a good finishing center, and other options as well when your own team is without Joel. So I think the key, as I think Doc has said, will be to kind of mix and match, and they have the options to do that. So I'm very curious to kind of see what they start out with, and I won't be surprised really any look they throw from at the tip tomorrow. But the key, as we've talked about, and Doc has said, will be to even if things work, to kind of change it around and make sure they don't get comfortable in a given half or in between games and kind of figure things out.
And then just conversely, what do you see with the Hawks? How do you see the Hawks matching up defensively with the Sixers starting five if Joel Embiid is out of the lineup?
Yeah, so I think if we're just going to assume that Matisse starts again, which I think is probably the safe bet, I think you'll probably see Trae Young and Matisse, right? I mean, Trae Young is a very poor defender, and they'll want to put him on the Sixers' worst offensive player in the starting five. You'd go probably Capella on Ben Simmons, right? I mean, that if Ben's the tallest guy, even if Tobias is kind of the de facto center on defense, you don't want Capella coming away from the rim, having to navigate kind of anything that Tobias does off the ball, even on the ball. You'll see Collins on Capella, or Collins on Harris, excuse me. You would see Hunter on. You probably see Hunter on Danny Green, I suppose, and then Bogdan on Seth, I guess would make the most sense there. Maybe you swap that because you say, hey, maybe Seth is more versatile with the ball in his hands. Hunter's a better defender. He's pretty good getting around screens. We saw what Seth could do when he was able to get open off the ball, especially against Davis Bertans in, I think, game 3. And so maybe they say, hey, let's throw Hunter on and maybe mitigate what he can do. We watched game 5. We saw Seth handle the ball more. We want to put a good defender on. So I guess I would probably, that I'm talking about it, I would think they'll throw Hunter on Seth and then Bogdan on Danny, because Danny's a nice offensive player, a nice complementary offensive player, but you don't ever want to deviate what your offensive game plan is to run more stuff through Danny. So that's kind of what I would see. So to kind of summarize, it'd be Trae on Matisse, Bogdan on Danny, Capella on Simmons, Collins on Harris, and Hunter on Seth would be my best assumption here.
No, I think that's a pretty fair way to look at it. Yeah, because you can't. Capella has to guard Simmons. That's really you can't have him on Tobias. That would just not work out at all. But I do think if they do that, Doc hasn't done it a ton, but we did see a little bit in game 5. Ben Simmons got to do it where if he had Daniel Gafford on him, he would just kind of go by him. And it's a very difficult spot. I mean, Capella is very, very good, better than Daniel Gafford, but it's still a tough spot for Capella if Ben Simmons is going to take him off the dribble and just try to get past him, and speed by him, use his quickness and his speed to get to the rim. Capella's much, like I said, much smarter, will probably recover better than Gafford did at times, but I could see that perhaps working out in the Sixers' favor. I also, and I don't want to discredit John Collins. I think John Collins is a good player, but I think that Tobias can beat John Collins one-on-one. I think that's a matchup that could potentially favor the Sixers.
Especially if they maybe run through some screens, like we saw the Wizards open the game, open game 1 with Rui Hachimura on Tobias, and Rui is a pretty solid isolation defender. But what the Sixers says, okay, you aren't really good navigating screens because you're a big human, and bigger humans typically struggle with that. So I could see them doing a similar thing with John Collins to say, okay, maybe it's a neutral, maybe it's a net zero if we just throw Tobias the ball in the mid post and ask him to create. But let's get him kind of downhill, run some screens, like force a 6'9", 6'10" power forward guarding Tobias to stay attached. So I could see that kind of being something that continues, because we saw it in round 1. But I am also curious with the Capella matchup, if we see the Sixers try and run some stuff where if Capella's going to sag off, let's force a switch. Let's have Ben set a really good screen for Seth Curry or Tobias Harris. Let's use that to our advantage. Tobias and Seth both love kind of that, 18 to 22 foot range, maybe Tobias a little closer in. But if Capella's going to sag off and wall off the paint against Ben, which is a smart idea, let's kind of force some switches. So, Ben, you've got to be really, really disciplined and smart in his screens, because, I think Ben's improved his screen over the years, but still something that both he and Joel are a little inconsistent with. But you can tell when they make good contact, they're getting guys open because it's the center who's guarding them usually, or usually in Joel's case at least. But in this case, it'll probably be Ben, obviously have him being defended by the center. So those are the big things I would look for, is just try and use a lot of screens and make sure they're set well, because yeah, I think there's advantages Tobias has on John Collins, but I don't think it's not the same whereas you can look back to maybe like I always remember back that Chicago game. I think it was Joel at 50, but when Tobias just attacked Patrick Williams in the mid post, I think in the second half, he doesn't quite have that same size and quickness advantage over John Collins. I don't think, but there are definitely ways he can get to his spots and do what he likes to do as a scorer. He just can't maybe be always to the mid post, but he'll definitely have opportunities for that. But those are the biggest things I'll be looking for, because this is kind of a tough matchup because the Hawks have a couple of big wings in a way that the Wizards just definitely lacked.
Right, and it's an excellent point with with Ben, if they're going to give him that, because that's got to be the strategy, is that Capella is going to sag way off to try to cut off those drives and not so he's already in the paint basically. But yeah, I agree, that is the best way to combat it, is to have him screen for Tobias, have him screen for Seth. I thought Seth and Tobias actually, that the little bit of a two-man game we saw from them in Game 5 was very encouraging. See if they can carry any of that over. And then the other thing, and I scribbled it down while you were talking because I was thinking about it, but like what we saw Doc do a little bit with the bench unit, we saw Matisse kind of almost play like a stretch 4-y kind of role, and at times set screens and roll and do things like that. So I could see that, if you're trying to make Trae, maybe make Trae Young work a little bit on the defensive end, that could be one way to do it. Maybe have Matisse out there, just set a bunch of screens and try to get some switches and try to get some mismatches that way as well. So I think that's one thing I think Doc could look to explore too. So when we're talking about Embiid, it's hard because I don't want to. I don't think like neither of us is in a position to speak to whether he could, whether he can, whether he should, whether he will, when he will. Like we just don't know. But yeah, what do you think? I guess we've already kind of touched on what we think the biggest adjustment would be, and that's with the starting lineup. Going to Matisse in that way. But what do you think kind of are the biggest adjustments for if he's in, if he's out, like what the obvious is, he's the offensive focal point of this team. So that's you're losing that. You're losing just that guy you can dump it down to and get a basket kind of most like 50% of the time. And then defensively, he's really the anchor. He's the guy that protects the rim. He's the guy that really kind of quarterbacks the whole thing and gets everyone in their place. So clearly they're going to have to play faster. That would be one thing. And I think that's one thing they did pretty well in Game 5, especially in the second half when they went to that small ball lineup. I thought they played a little bit faster. Them playing good defense helped, I thought, too. They were really good rotationally and with their help defense. And when they trapped Beal and forced a couple turnovers and got him to break the other way. Do you see an advantage anywhere as far as, if the Sixers are playing small, can they run on the Hawks? Or do you think they're better off in the half court, kind of like we already talked about with, running a two-man game with Tobias or Seth, or whether it's been screening for Tobias and Seth and, forcing Capella into some tough decisions? Like, what do you think is the best way to kind of go about it if Joel Embiid is out?
Yeah, I mean, I think, definitely run when, applicable. Again, I don't think running for the sake of running is ever the way to go about it. There's sometimes kind of a misconception like, oh, the faster you play, the better your offense. That's not really true. You should run when there's opportunities. So, and, with Ben Simmons at the helm, you will always run if there's an opportunity because he is great at that. But yeah, I think that is something that maybe like that's something that they always try to do without Joel. Even dating back before Doc, they've always tried to play a little faster when he's out there because Ben becomes the focal point. But I think especially when you are playing against a great rim protector like Capella, who can play fairly big minutes, but I think there's still a little bit of a worry that like, I think that if you get him into the 36 to 37 minute range, which he might have to play for the Hawks, like it's not a win for the Sixers, but I do kind of wonder, like, is he up for that task to an extent? So I think if you can play faster in the minutes he's out there, that's an absolutely a benefit because like the reason I said, but also because if you just get the rim protector away from the basket, or if he's trailing a play, it makes it easier for a guy like Ben to attack, or Tobias, or things like that. So that's kind of what I would try to do at times. But again, I don't want to just run for the sake of it. But I do wonder that if they didn't be up the tempo a little bit, if that could be something that, late in the fourth quarter, Capella is a little more gassed than normal and he's late to make that rotation on a back cut or something like that, or he just he's not quite positioned to wall off a Ben drive, and Ben uses his strength to push push Capella out of the way and get kind of his space for a finish there. But in the half court, yeah, I think what you mentioned, maybe using Matisse as a screener is a great idea. We saw that. I think it was maybe the game in March against the Bulls when Embiid and Simmons were out, if I recall. Matisse had a few plays as a screener.
You might be right there, yeah.
He was right after the All-Star break, if I recall correctly. But yeah, Matisse kind of talked post game that he kind of liked doing that. But I think Doc, even said they hadn't run a lot of that for him. But yeah, I agree. You know, like kind of in a lighthearted manner, I think watching what the Knicks didn't do and trying to do that would because and they have much better offensive personnel. I mean, one team has Julius Randle that has to run through the offense, or they run the most of the offense through, and everyone else is kind of a complementary player. There are more guys you can kind of handle the ball and attack Trae with. So that would be, you know, again, you don't want to just attack Trae all the time, but if you can kind of work your offensive philosophy, you know, kind of meant into attacking Trae, whether it's, you know, kind of the inverted pick and rolls with Seth as a screener or whoever, or Matisse as a screener, as you mentioned, that's the kind of thing I think would work too. But yeah, I think you kind of touched on in terms of the advantages. I think it's going to have to be, you know, a lot of Tobias stuff and getting Tobias downhill through a screen, because I think Collins is a good isolation defender, but I don't trust him to navigate 2 or 3 off-ball screens that I like to run Tobias through at times. So those are the ways that I would go about it. But I think it's just kind of, it's sticking to what they've done without Embiid all year offensively, or that's worked. But trying to be careful about it in the sense that, like, how can we exploit maybe the weaknesses we see in Atlanta without just making that a like, we're not going to go switch hunting, right? We're not going to play the Nets, things like that, where they try to attack kind of any mismatch there. So that's what I would go about it. But it's I mean, I keep saying it, but it's really tough without Joel, because as you mentioned, you've got a really great advantage with Joel who gets the line 9 or 10 times, and this year especially doesn't really overextend himself offensively because he's been so good with the jumper, right? He doesn't have to back down as much. So it's tough, but the kind of the things I mentioned might be the best way to find some advantages and maybe some benefits, you know, sans Joel Embiid.
You said something interesting there when we're talking about Capella and the idea that can he hold up? Can he play 36, 38 minutes? And I feel like if you get into a situation where maybe you do make him run, maybe you do wear him down, or maybe you wear him down to the point where he, you know, gets a little undisciplined and gets into foul trouble, what have you. If Atlanta then counters and goes small themselves at some point, and, you know, maybe they put Collins at the 5, bring in whoever, whether it's Lou, whether it's Kevin Hurt or whatever, and just kind of go small. Do you think the Sixers having it, like, I guess, I mean, without 100% knowing who they would go to, let's say for an argument's sake, they go to Herder. Do you think the Sixers could have an advantage with their small ball lineup against Atlanta's small ball lineup, or do you see them as kind of even?
I think they definitely could have an advantage there, just because then you would go, because it kind of when the Hawks go small, they'll go with, or I was going to put all their names together. They go with either John Collins or Danilo Gallinari at the 5. And even their backup center in Onyeka Okongwu is small, right? I mean, he's a 6'8", 6'9" rookie. Right. So anytime Capella's out of the game, they are kind of by default small compared to a traditional starting 5, which is where I think the Sixers could thrive, because then everything kind of shifts back to a normal matchup, right? In terms of like where the Sixers have a size advantage, you have to go Collins on Simmons, and then Hunter on Tobias, and so forth, and you would have Herder on Danny or Seth. So I think kind of maybe size wise, there's not a huge difference there, but I like the Sixers' talent advantages in that sense, right? I think maybe the size advantage the Hawks' normal starting 5 has can maybe mitigate some of that, but I don't think the Hawks' starting 5 is not talented. I don't want to say that, I guess, because it is very talented, very good team. But I think when you take away Capella, then the Sixers get the advantage back, both in maybe size and talent. Whereas in the normal starting 5, it's kind of without Embiid, it's kind of the talent is fairly similar, but the Hawks have the size advantage. So I definitely think there are, you know, some advantage they can find there. But I am really curious with the Capella stuff, because I mean, he played 34 minutes in the first round, but you kind of look through his resume, like he played 33 minutes in Houston the last couple of years, but he was dealing with injuries. I mean, he missed almost a year after he was traded because he had foot injuries and things like that. He only played about 30 minutes during Houston's couple of really great runs with Harden and Paul there. So, or with Harden and CP there. So I am curious. It's not something I'm like, oh, I think it's totally exploitable, but it's more like an unknown for me right now that I think could be an advantage for the Sixers if they are able to make if these games are super competitive and forcing Capella into high minutes. So, but I definitely do think there maybe could be some advantages with the small ball lineup there if Atlanta goes there.
It's such a chess match, and like they all are. Like every series is so, and that's what's kind of cool about. I mean, it's any sport that has a series, but especially in basketball, like the way every game can look different, and every it's just, and the way these coaches kind of make these changes and make adjustments. And we'll see what happens. Is it going to be a situation where maybe, like you said, maybe Capella can play 36, 38 minutes and he'll be just fine and he'll play great and play it, to his potential, and that would be pretty damaging for the Sixers. That would be not so great, because then that would really hurt them, in that matchup. Uh, but talking about that, like I was pretty impressed with the way Doc Rivers, clearly not his first rodeo, but I was really impressed with the way he kind of made adjustments as the series went on with the Wizards. The fact that he was not afraid to go to Tyrese Maxey, even though he is a 20-year-old rookie, and Doc doesn't always have the best track record with playing young players. And Doc, that was one thing I was concerned about, and like going back to his other stops, is kind of his stubbornness in wanting to play certain guys, and wanting and wanting certain certain lineups, whatever, and not maybe adjusting as much as he should. But I was impressed by a couple things. One, like I already mentioned, his willingness and his trust in going to Tyrese Maxey, who had played so well to close out the regular season and clearly carried it over, and clearly what had it was a very good matchup for him against the Wizards. And then also I was I if I were a betting man, and I am not, I would have bet a lot of money on Mike Scott starting game 5, because I just thought that's where Doc
Mhm.
would go, because like that's just what Doc has
Mhm.
done. So I was impressed that he said, you know what? Nope, that's not our best method here. Let's go small. Let's start Matisse. I was very impressed that he made that adjustment, because if you looked in the regular season, it's not a look he liked to go to. He did not like to go to that lineup where it's either whatever, Tobias, Ben at that 5, whatever, however you want to look at it.
And he
It's
didn't like
not
to take key bench players out of their spots. I mean, you look when Shake was playing
right.
well and guys missed time, he didn't start Shake. He started Dwight a little bit, but then when they realized that Tony Bradley could play when he was still there, they would start him. So I didn't mean to cut you off, but I agree
No,
that
no.
like I was surprised too that that's where they went, for sure. And I think he was talking about it. Maybe was it yesterday after Game 5 where his rationale for it was really good too. He said that he thought Matisse helped Ben and Tobias the most in terms of him and starting the lineup. So he recognizes the point is to maximize his two best available players. And so I really like that part of it, is that you kind of give don't have. I think his idea was that he didn't want to start Ben on Bradley Beal and let Matisse get that first look there, kind of let Ben do his thing as a roamer, and let Tobias also kind of hold down the fort inside, which admittedly didn't work great to start, but yeah, I totally agree that I think I did a podcast before game 5, and I was like, I think Mike Scott's gonna start. It's not what I would do, but I think it's who he'll go with. So yeah, if I would have had to bet as well, I would have lost a bit of money on that one for sure.
Yeah, I my with the guy, I actually thought Maxi would have been an interesting guy to start. As you mentioned, he did close that game, so I'll take some points in knowing that that was clearly a good lineup, to have the regular starting 4 with Tyrese Maxey in there. That's the lineup that closed the game. So clearly that was a good thing. But yeah, and what I think is good too. So let's say you go to that Matisse lineup and it doesn't work out, because you're right. They didn't get off to a great start in Game 5. In the second half, that lineup did much better in the second half. But in the first half, I think that was the adjustment of they, like Doc mentioned, they had one day basically to get ready to play without Joel, and to figure out how to play with this lineup. So it was not no credit to them that they were able to do it and figure it out in the second half and get better. But I think the beauty of what this rotation, the players they have, is if it doesn't work out, and with Matisse, like I think defensively, I think that's the optimal lineup, but offensively, perhaps it's not. To have a guy like a George Hill you could go to that can give you more ball handling, give you more shooting, and you're not losing that much on defense, or even Maxi in that case where maybe you don't get in the shooting, but you get some of those downhill drives, and maybe he can create space and collapse the defense and open up some things on the perimeter for Danny or Seth or Tobias or whomever to kind of operate. So yeah, I mean, like I said, I was impressed with the way Doc made the adjustments. He did things that um, maybe in his past years maybe would have been outside his comfort zone, but he did it. And when I look at the rotation as a whole, they're a pretty deep team, especially compared to the last couple of seasons. I always think back to 2 years ago, when they're playing against Toronto, and Brett Brown is literally going to Mike Scott and James Ennis, and that's it. You can't even play a third center. Boban got played off the floor. Greg Monroe got played off the floor.
He tried to sneak Joel 45 seconds of rest in the first half, and Greg Monroe was a -10 or whatever it was in 47 seconds. And
it was a -9, and I believe it was like a minute and like a few seconds.
I know the number was
outrageous.
I know like the entire like plus minus number from that series and that game was ridiculous. Yes. There was that one stretch where he tried to just sneak Joel like a minute before halftime or something, like during a free throw, and I think like Monroe comes in on the second free throw. There's like a loose ball scramble. Toronto goes down and scores. Greg Monroe turns it over. He gets an and one. Yeah. It was some of it was Greg Monroe's fault, but it was just the most ridiculous thing that like Brett was just trying to save his best player a couple of minutes before halftime, and it might have ended up costing him the entire series.
Seriously. No, yeah, the plus minus for the series, it was literally like 100 plus 100 with him on and plus 100 minus 100 with him off. Like literally, it was that.
But to your point, yeah, they're much deeper, and I think the one thing that I'm still closely monitoring with Doc is like I don't think he should go 9 deep in the second round. I think he should be willing to play 9 or 10 different guys, like based on the matchups, and that's kind of I think either we've talked about or I've talked or Doc has talked about as well. Like, be willing to kind of play any of those 5 perimeter guys off the bench, whether it's George Hill, Shake Milton, Tyrese Maxey, Matisse Thybulle, Furkan Korkmaz. I think that's 5, yeah. But that doesn't mean I don't really think Shake right now, the way he kind of struggling should be in that conversation. Maybe he figures it out. Maybe he kind of gets his rhythm back at some point. But be at least willing to consider any of them. But it doesn't mean to play 4 or 5 of them on a given night. It means to like, if maybe you need a little more offense, you go with Maxey. If you need a blend of both, you go with George Hill. You need a stopper out there. So this is all assuming that Joel Embiid is playing. You go Matisse Thybulle. So that's the biggest thing that I'm curious to see if Doc makes that shift, because I agree that he's been like, and I think in Game 5 he only played 9 guys. Again, it's tough to know. Was that because he didn't really like what he saw from Furkan? He played a lot of guys, but he didn't play more. He only played 9 guys, I think, more than like 20 minutes or something, or 15 minutes. So was that more a product of Joel's absence, or was it him kind of realizing maybe we need to? But that's the biggest thing, is maybe we need to kind of trim down the rotation. But I will be curious to see in this series. And the thing I would kind of what I would do in his situation would be to consider all these guys, but never to play all of them in a given game or during a given close game. Maybe you get garbage minutes or whatever, but that's kind of how I would go about it. But I agree that they have some options. It's just a matter of not confusing options for all requiring playing time in the playoffs.
No, I agree. And I will say this, because you're right. There were, I want to say almost every game in the series, he played 11 guys in the first half. But in the games that were closer during crunch time, he did shrink it. So I will give him that. And yeah, but to your point, I don't know that he can mess around against a really good Hawks team. Like with the Washington Wizards, you can get away with that and perhaps not play your best basketball in the first half and try some things. And in the second half, really turn it on, and that worked. But this Hawks team is too good, I think, to kind of dilly dally and mess around and play 11 guys. I think it is. I think it's 8 or 9, and like you said, it's matchup based. I think the ninth, the locks are George, Dwight, and Matisse, and the 9th guy is depending on if you need shooting, it's Furkan Korkmaz. If you need creation and someone getting downhill, it's Tyrese Maxey. If you want to, if you maybe need a guy who can maybe do a little bit of both, with creation and shooting, and you want to see if maybe Shake can give you something, maybe you go to Shake. But to your point right now, unfortunately, he is just in a confidence.
I think Shake getting any minutes would have to be contingent him like finding some rhythm in garbage time right now. Right? Like I don't think the way he's playing, unfortunately, would warrant him getting any serious minutes. Or like I don't think he should be able to. I don't think Doc should try to have him play through it during an important series like this. But yeah, and I'm even like I don't know. It's tough because like I feel like everywhere George Hill goes, it's like he's a great fit and he is a good player, but you always kind of want a little more offensively from him. I think that's just kind of who he is.
Right.
But I think I definitely want to keep playing because he's done a lot of subtle things throughout the first round. Like he had some really nice, like I think I was like rewatching Game 5 or something. You just like see some night, like he had a couple of like off ball screens that opened up scores. He had a nice like assist, a couple of nice assists, I think. But the nice thing I think too is even if like I don't think they're gonna bench George or anything like that or like reduce his minutes, but even if like there's a game where maybe he or Tyrese doesn't play as much, like both those guys are going to be ready because Tyrese has proven it and George is a guy who clearly has been through this type of thing before with his experience kind of on deep playoff runs. So that's kind of the nice thing is you especially with Maxey, right, that maybe he doesn't play for a game or game and a half. We know we'll call on him and he'll play the exact same way. He won't look timid. He'll show all the improvements that he's made throughout the year. Like that's a really nice thing to have with a rookie guard that provides some pretty key skills that, even if he misses a game or two, it's not gonna shake him. Because I mean, he was out of the rotation for a month or so, month and a half, and he came back and was a much better player. Never really showed that he didn't really show any like lack of confidence, things like that. So that's kind of where I stand on the rotation. But yeah, I think it's gotta be 8.5, and even then, I think I think you mostly just play a guy like Dwight because you need someone to rest, right? You don't play you're not really going to play Dwight because you like what he brings, of course. That's not I don't want to phrase like that. That was poor wording, but
No, I
you
get
play
what you
Dwight
mean.
to give the other guys a rest. And you like what he provides as a backup center, but you don't say, oh, Dwight's playing well, let's keep him in there, right? Like as opposed to maybe Matisse or George Hill or Tyrese Maxey is playing well, and you say, let's give Seth a couple more minutes to rest, or Danny. So yeah, I mean, Doc's got a pretty important balance on his hands, but I think he laid the foundation pretty well in the first round. But to your point, he can't really experiment in the first half like we kind of saw in every game of that series, because it's a much better team, and now the Sixers are going to be at least dealing with a compromised Joel Embiid.
Yeah, Dwight Howard has a potential. I mean, I agree with you. Like, it's probably not good. It's not going to be big minutes, but I'm very intrigued because he flat out wasn't good for 4 games. He was really ineffective for 4 games. Couldn't not commit fouls. He kept, they did call that series a little tight, and he does have a reputation. So when, it's a bad mix, and, that does limit his effectiveness, but at the same time, he just didn't have a very good 4 games. And in game 5, I thought that was what you want out of him. It was energy. It was setting good screens. It was hitting the offensive glass. He does provide that energy, that intangible energy, which is, as much as that seems like a throwaway thing, it's not. I mean, that's something that's real. When a team is struggling, you throw in a guy like that. If you're struggling offensively and, you're missing shots, having a guy like that can, get you an extra possession or two, that's something. I mean, that definitely is helpful. So we'll see what he looks like in this series with a more traditional big, if he goes up against Capella, and then also if the series maybe isn't as called as tightly and he can get away with a thing or two, perhaps that'll help him too. But I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you so much for coming on so much, man. I appreciate it. Jackson Frank, please let everyone know where they can find you on social media, where they can find your work.
Yeah, so the easiest way to answer that would be to just find my Twitter at @JackFrank_JJF. Everywhere I write and talk about the NBA is in my bio there. Doing most of my Sixers stuff over at Locker Room these days. Didn't have a formal series preview there this time, but have been kind of all over some different podcasts, giving my thoughts on it. So I'll be sure to do a lot of stuff on Locker. Like, I think any Sixers listeners, if you want to, find my thoughts throughout the series, I'll be trying to do some sort of recap after every game over there. But yeah, Paul, I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you having me on. Excuse me. I'm so used to doing it the other way. Since you've been in a locker room a few times, but I appreciate the kind words, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon. And really looking forward to this series, because I think it's a really fascinating kind of battle with so many unknowns, especially on the Sixers side of things with Joel Embiid's status unclear at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. And it's so funny because we never know. I will never forget that Nets game when he was listed as doubtful, and then he played, and then they lost. And then they won 4 straight to win the series, and
he missed game 2, and they got blown out of game 1. And not only Jimmy Butler played well, it was
bad.
Yeah, and then I think Ben played really well in the second game, played really well in the third game as well. But I remember that too. It was like, it almost kind of felt like the sky was falling, because it was like, right. Joel's out of game 2, they're going down 0-2 at home. Jimmy's disengaged. Like, what it's like, it's the sky is falling for them. But
I always find it, with Sixers fans, man, I always find it so fun. And I saw the one tweet that was going around that was really funny, and I apologize because I'm not giving the person credit who sent it first. But they said, "Is your mental health tied to a 7-foot Cameroonian's health, or are you normal?" And it's like, yeah, like, it's so true with Sixers, and I feel for them. And I, like you already talked about, like, I feel for Joel, man, the poor guy, like, did everything right this year, got himself in the best shape possible, had an MVP caliber season. It sucks that it's kind of, what's happening here. Hopefully he can be a close version of himself and stay healthy, and hopefully finish out the playoffs. But again, Jackson Frank, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you guys all so much for checking out Coming In for a Landing. I am your host, Paul Hudrick. Please rate, subscribe, comment, download, whatever you got to do with the podcast. I appreciate you guys all so much, and I will talk to you next time.